Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to be joined by the chairman of the Brexit Party, the former MEP, Richard Tice. Richard Tice, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. Looking forward to chatting across a whole range of issues.
So Richard, right now, obviously, we've all been so impacted by the coronavirus crisis. Now we're starting to see the easing of lockdown. Super Saturday just passed on July the 4th. What has been your overall assessment of how the government has handled the crisis and is handling things on the economic front now?
To be honest, I have actually been, generally very critical of the vast majority of the way the government has handled this crisis. The truth is that I want people to think about one word: late. The government has been late on literally everything. They were late on shutting the borders when other countries were shutting the borders. They were late on the lockdown. They were late on protecting care homes and shielding the vulnerable. They were late on the issue of testing, tracking and tracing. They were late on ensuring that we had sufficient PPE. All of these issues, actually, they had warning, and yet they were late on making decisions for a whole bunch of reasons that we can come into. And then, having been late all the way through the crisis, they're now late on the way out of it. So, in my view, what was very clear from about week 2 or 3 was that there was a serious danger that they would be trying to save lives that were at risk because of COVID, but that actually there would be greater risk that more lives would be lost or be shortened or damaged from other issues such as cancer, patients not being assessed, cardiac patients not being treated, the mental health of people, in particular children. And at the time I was massively criticised, but the truth is, it's now coming, people are now realising, the data's out there, that, some of these other illnesses, ailments, medical conditions have been massively impacted by the focus on COVID. So actually, rather than save lives, what actually the government's performance has done is actually to, sadly, tragically, accelerate the loss of other lives. And it was never an issue of lives versus the economy. It was lives v lives. And the government, in particular Matt Hancock, focused totally on COVID at the expense of the health and well-being of the vast majority of the population. So, as I say, they've been late on the way in, they're now late on the way out. They're decimating the travel and tourism industry because they suddenly came up with a bright idea. I mean, so late it was just literally laughable. It became a global laughing stock of shutting the borders and quarantining people when everybody else was actually opening up. So yeah, no, I've been a big critic, woeful decision-making, this absurd notion that they've followed the science. Let me tell you, this government has made the wrong decisions at the wrong time based on the wrong advice from the scientists that they chose to use. And let's remember, science is a bit like economists, scientists. You're as unlikely to get scientists to agree on something as you are to get 10 economists in a room agreeing on something. Science evolves. It continues to change and evolve. It's not fixed. And so this mantra that we're guided by the science, well, the truth was they were guided by their unwillingness to use their own common sense, their own gut instinct, and to make some courageous political decisions. And what's interesting is when you look at other international leaders, look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who made bold, brave decisions really early, and Australia. Those nations, island nations, we're an island nation. They had strong, bold leadership. We've had weak, feeble leadership, and sadly, people have paid with their lives as a result.
Richard, how would you assess the government's economic handling, both in terms of the furlough scheme particularly, and what we're starting to see now? We're recording this on Wednesday. We know the Chancellor is due to make some announcements later on. We're not sure what they'll be by the time this goes live. We will know what those announcements were. Talk a bit about that. What do you see as the Treasury's handling?
In a sense, Rishi Sunak's handling with the furlough scheme is really the only success story in the government's handling of this crisis. Having said that, there are millions of people, self-employed people, who've had no help whatsoever, and they seem to have been basically left and completely abandoned, even though the government knew who they were and how they could be helped. So, but I accept you can't protect every job and every business. So, his performance and the Treasury's performance has been relatively good, but again, they've been late on the way out, and I think they're now playing catch up. But already, sadly, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs being lost as we speak. Because there's a complete lack of confidence, in particular in the hospitality and the travel industry. It's been just a complete fiasco, and no one knows whether they're looking at 2 meters social distancing. Is it 1 meter? The truth is, actually, with sensible hygiene measures, we could have done what other countries have done. Hey, countries like Slovenia, you arrive at a restaurant or a shop, you wash your hands on the way in, and you wash your hands on the way out. And if you're in a restaurant or something, you order using an app on your way in. This stuff is not rocket science. This stuff was there, it was easy. And what is so embarrassing is that other nations around the world have done this successfully, and our government woefully they haven't applied common sense. They haven't looked at other international success stories. So I'm desperately worried. About what's going on in London. I've just written an article this week. Central London is a complete ghost town. Residential rents have crashed 25% in 2 or 3 months. Office rents are going to crash by the same or more over the next few months. Many firms are talking about not coming back until the new year or next year. Great hotels are not going to reopen. There's no tourists, there's no visitors, and there's no salesmanship from the government or from the Mayor of London to say, London's open, the United Kingdom is open, we're open for business, we've got on top of this, we've got a world-leading track and trace system, and we're going to move forwards. So yeah, I'm highly critical, and I fear the consequences. And what I really worry about is a government that's been so woeful on the way through this crisis. It doesn't give anybody any confidence that they're going to succeed on driving the economy and the way to recover out of this crisis. But we'll wait and see.
Now, Richard, obviously, Brexit enables the UK to grab the bull by the horns to carve out its own destiny. Heaven knows that will be extremely necessary in the wake of COVID-19. Now, right now, the EU and the UK are in this transition period due to end at the end of this year. We've now passed the point, the deadline moment when the UK or the EU could have asked for an extension. That has come and gone. We hear in the media there have been a lot of sticking points, whether it's the so-called level playing field, fishing, state aid rules, and well, we don't know what's going to happen with state aid rules considering the coronavirus crisis. What has been your overall assessment of how these negotiations have gone, and do you think the deadline for extension coming and going will focus minds?
But actually, credit where credit is due. We in the Brexit Party put huge pressure on the government in the last few months of 2019. It was us that forced them to commit not to extend the transition period in their manifesto, and then quite rightly they put it in domestic UK law. And actually they have stuck to their word. The appointment of David Frost as chief negotiator has turned out to be a complete masterstroke, because guess what? If you want someone to negotiate a good deal for you, it does help if they actually believe in what they're negotiating in, as opposed to the previously disastrous Ollie Robbins under the previous regime. So look, they've done a good job so far. Of course, going past the extension date, they all knew that we weren't going to extend. That does focus the minds. And, you know, in the world of business that I come from for over the last 30 years, there's nothing like a short deadline to concentrate the minds, to focus the attention, and to agree what's agreeable. And it may well be that, I think it's the most likely case, that they will agree some form of partial deal, which, yes, it'll involve an element of compromise. But people seem to think that you need a trade deal to cover absolutely everything. You don't. Why not agree a partial deal on the stuff that you know you can agree, and then put some of the harder stuff, you can put that into to phase two. So, you know, that's what I think is likely to happen. The EU has a long track record, almost like in their eyes, a glorious reputation for running negotiations right until literally the last minute before midnight. So there's talk about something being agreed by the end of July. I think the UK is pushing for that, and that's the right strategy. I'd be delighted. I mean, if not, you know, we need to make it very clear that actually, you know, we are walking away. I think that message is now there. And of course, you know, one of the tragedies of COVID is, in a sense, throughout this difficult crisis, you know, international trade clearly has dropped significantly. But what it does mean actually is that, you know, if we do move, if we don't find a deal and we move to operate under the Australia type approach, under the umbrella of WTO rules, then actually the quantity of international trade is at a historic low for many years. Many businesses anyway have realized the flaws in being so over-reliant in a just-in-time international supply chain. You know, at the first sign of trouble in a number of areas, that supply chain has broken. So actually what you need is, and I think businesses really, they've had plenty of time to be planning for this, to say, do you know what, actually, maybe we should actually think British, make British, and let's buy British. And there's so many different areas, you know, in fishing, in farming. And again, actually, credit where credit's due. I was delighted just in the last few days when the government confirmed that it had successfully bid to invest £500 million in acquiring a substantial stake in the satellite business that had got into trouble called OneWeb. That's a huge statement of confidence in building a network of low orbit satellites, which, you know, could be really, really good for improving broadband signal all over the country. So, you know, that was a real statement of intent, and again, the government does deserve credit for that. And that's what I call a post-Brexit opportunity, and there are lots of them. Interestingly, my daughter she's a key worker fruit picking in the county of Kent, strawberries, and, you know, there's not many Brits doing it, but she is doing it. But what I've learned from that actually is, you know, we're using some incredible technology now to grow many more strawberries and raspberries and other fruit than we used to. And actually, but there's also an opportunity to use more technology. We don't need to be so reliant on you know, workers coming to pick this fruit. What actually we could do is use the government could say, well, I'm going to invest in the R&D to create the strawberry equivalent of a combine harvester. The only reason that's never been done, for example, is because of the availability of low-cost, low-skilled workers from overseas. So again, that's a sort of post-Brexit opportunity, and there are many, many more.
I certainly agree with you, Richard. There are lots of opportunities right now at this moment in time to reshore and onshore critical industry. It's interesting you mentioned the trade deals and the importance of trade deals. Now, right now, the UK is engaged, we are told, with in deal negotiations with the United States, with Japan, with fellow Commonwealth countries, Australia and New Zealand. how important are these? I mean, Germany trades extensively with countries in Asia, but it doesn't have a big network of trade deals, as I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. How important are these trade deals?
I think the truth is, they're the icing on the cake. Fundamentally, if you've got a good product at a good price, then unless there are onerous or punitive tariffs applied by another nation, then you'll be able to sell that product. It's interesting, isn't it? Our biggest single export partner at the moment, historically in the last few years, is none other than the United States. And we have a significant trade surplus with the US. We don't have a trade deal. Now, if we did, or indeed probably which I think is much more likely, a partial trade deal, then we can increase the quantity of trade. I'll take a simple one, for example, with the US, is on tariffs on cars. At the moment, the US charge a tariff of just 2.5% on cars that we export to them from the European Union, whereas the EU imposes a 10% tariff on cars coming from the US to the EU. That's just ludicrous. And frankly, you could agree over a coffee that let's just put those both down to zero. And we've got the ability to do that. And that's why I think you pick off the low-hanging fruit, the easy things to do. And you might say, do you know what, agriculture, there's all sorts of myths and fear-mongering. It's like Project Fear, around 6 or 7, I've lost count, to do with some of the issues surrounding agriculture. If that's too difficult, just put it into the phase 2 box. But let's build some confidence, get some additional, zero tariffs and quotas agreed on items such as I've just mentioned, on things like wine you can do, and a variety of others. And so we build from there.
But it's certainly the case, isn't it, that almost every product we get from we can import from Europe, we could import from the United States and other non-EU trading partners. Richard, there will be people listening to us who would say, okay, fine, but the UK is cutting its nose off to spite its face. It's walking away from this 450 million strong market.
No, I've got to stop you there. We're not walking away from anybody.
I agree with you. I agree.
We've left a bureaucratic institution.
Absolutely.
What we're saying we want to do a simple free trade deal. We've already got the basic terms there. We're saying we won't charge you anything. You don't charge us anything. And it's not difficult. You can apply the standard requirements and regulations that is standard in these international trade agreements, the sort of thing, hey, guess what, the EU recently have agreed with Canada. Why not take that as a template and use that? So we're not walking away. What we're saying is it's got to be fair, it's got to be on sensible, internationally recognized and accepted standards, and that's all we want. And then we're free to make our other choices with other nations. Think of all the trade deals that we could do with our Commonwealth friends all around the world. 2 billion people, 4 times as big as the EU. So and there's all sorts of ludicrous anomalies. For example, processed coffee from that's grown and developed in Africa. There are extraordinarily complex tariff issues around that. We could scrap all of that sort of thing with Kenya and that and the like, just as one example. So there's opportunities. Commonwealth countries would love to do that. There's opportunities with India, and of course there's difficulties. But that's why I come back to this point. Why not agree the things that you can agree between countries, build some confidence, and then move forward from there. And it's what you keep doing is you keep building more and more icing on the cake.
Richard, I certainly agree with you about the Commonwealth. I've written about that myself extensively. But obviously, as there are critics who would say, okay, I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of walking away. But the idea that what they would say is the UK would never be able to compensate for losses from Brexit, with a trade deal with the US or a trade deal with Australia or a trade deal with Japan. And obviously you've addressed that. Perhaps you'd like to address it a little bit more as well. Just the idea in some way, it's not a zero-sum game, as it were, between Europe and non-European countries. The UK can continue to trade, as you say, with Europe extensively, but it can also build new relations around the world too.
Yeah, look, I don't accept this notion that there have to be losses. Frankly, I just think that's what the other side would say. It's fundamentally not true. They very quickly forget, we've had a huge currency depreciation, standing, I think, now at well over 20% from before the referendum to where sterling stands against the EU now. So actually, UK exporters they're either able to charge less for their goods overseas, or actually they're making greater profits. And interestingly, the reverse hasn't proven to be true, has it? We haven't seen huge inflation here in the UK, which is what economists would normally say you would normally experience. Why? Because of the deflationary impact of technology and competition driving down prices. So, exporters, they've had a bonus from the currency, and they will have used that in different ways. But I think what this COVID crisis has taught us is the really important thing of what I call economic patriotism. And this is where I hugely admire the French economy, the French consumer, because they are patriotic buyers of French products. And we also need to be much more patriotic in what we buy. I've used this crisis to really focus on English wine, and I found some very drinkable whites, reds, rosés, grown here in the UK. Our techniques have improved, and again, so we need to be much more patriotic about what we make, what we grow, in particular for key strategic issues, whether it's medicines. We suddenly discovered, because of this crisis, that the vast majority of, I think, paracetamol is made in India, and there was a global shortage of paracetamol. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Why can't we make that here in the UK? Of course we should. We must. We absolutely must. Likewise, there's talk about, would there be a shortage of insulin, protective equipment? It turns out, actually, we now can make, and we have started to make PPE. These are the sort of things where, we have been badly misled by the multinational corporates and the establishment and our civil servants into believing that the only way forward was total free globalism, and that actually just-in-time delivery meant that there was no risk at all. Well, I tell you what, we've learned a big, harsh lesson in this crisis, and items that are critically important, including, I may say, food. Actually, we need to focus here in the UK, and I think we should be really proud. Think British, make British, buy British. It's there to be done. 30 years ago, we were producing 80% of the food that we consume. Now, we're producing just under 60% from the last numbers I read. So that's a huge drop. UK farmers are desperate to be able to, increase their production. And that, again, is a great opportunity. It requires investments, it requires marketing, it requires long-term thinking, and strategic direction from the government. And, again, it's an opportunity. I'd love this government to do a brilliant job at this. I'm just worried, based on the track record, that they may fall short.
Richard, we're on the same page, certainly, in terms of the onshoring and reshoring of critical industries. I often make the point about the UK utilising its superlative higher education sector for one. I want to ask you about the Commonwealth. You mentioned that, and I also want to talk about Europe. But on the issue you just raised, obviously that brings China into focus, because we have seen the West's over-reliance in a way, potentially, that country, certainly in terms of industrial products. Do you think there is going to be a reset now between the West and China? Are we due for a reset?
Well, again, we have had a massive wake-up call on a number of different fronts, haven't we? I mean, first of all, in terms of the evolution of this crisis, we don't still truly know exactly when it started, the virus in China, but it was clearly in the last few months of last year. They tried to cover it up. When they couldn't cover it up, they tried to deny it. Then they prevented people talking about it. They misled the World Health Organization. Finally the truth came out, by which time actually it had already spread. So we've got the likelihood is that it's come from a laboratory, not from one of these wet markets. But I think we've all learned that fundamentally, the Chinese Communist Party that runs China is a authoritarian dictatorship. The way that it represses, for example, the Uyghur Muslims, over 1 million of them. What we've just seen with the new national security law with Hong Kong, they've literally driven a coach and horses through a 50-year international treaty. So I think everybody's having a massive, massive wake-up call about our relationship with China. And yeah, I think we need to, frankly, I think that the international community needs to start essentially going on a buyer's strike of Chinese goods. And, they've got a long track record of stealing international property, international patents. So yeah, it's an opportunity to reset. I hope that our leaders will take it, and ultimately money talks. And it was interesting just this week, the Chinese ambassador to the UK, he essentially sort of threatened the UK that if we didn't continue to buy Huawei components in our telecoms infrastructure, if we did actually welcome Hong Kong citizens here into the UK, that this would be sort of punished. Well, the good news about that is that actually shows they're rattled. And those that say, we haven't got any influence over China, well, once they start threatening you, you know that actually we've got them concerned. So I think there is an opportunity to reset. Huawei is something that worries me enormously. And again, it's quite clear that the government and Boris Johnson have been really badly misled by some of the telecom multinationals, by people like Sir Mark Sedwill, who's National Security Advisor, and by civil servants, many of whom, of course, when they leave government, who do they go and work for? Oh yes, they go and sit on the board of some Chinese company, or advisory board or lobbying group. I think the government's been badly misled about the true influence of Huawei in the emerging 5G network, compared to other companies that have components that can successfully do that. Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung. So, there are plenty of alternatives. There are other countries like South Korea, like the US, that are developing 5G networks where they've actually banned Huawei components. So, we're learning a lot. I'm delighted that people like Bob Seeley, Tom Tugendhat, Ian Duncan Smith, what I call experienced, wise heads on the Tory backbenches are putting real pressure on the government to show some courage and to stand up and lead the international community in putting pressure on China. We want to welcome them as decent international trading partners and a trading nation that that complies with the international rules-based order. What we've seen recently is that actually at the moment they can't be trusted, and they need to understand that the international community cannot accept that.
Richard, you've obviously spoken there about China. We've seen Australia particularly be quite vocal in their criticism of China in the last month or so. You mentioned the Commonwealth. I'm a big fan of the Commonwealth. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly with the Commonwealth realms like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Countries arguably the UK turned its back on back in the early 70s when it moved into the common market. Talk a little bit about that, Richard. What do you see as the big opportunities there with the Commonwealth, both the realms and the emerging markets such as India and Nigeria?
Well, as you've just said, many of the Commonwealth countries are huge, huge economies. They're growing fast, like India, and actually, we've got so much in common with India. There are 2 billion people across the world in the Commonwealth countries, and sadly, they did feel that we had turned our back on them when we joined the EU back in the 70s. And many of them, I think, are absolutely delighted now that there's an additional focus on, enhancing the Commonwealth network and focusing on that through trade, through cooperation. It's full of opportunities, and of course, there's over 1 billion people in India. So for everybody who says, "Oh, we've got to be nice to China because we buy all our goods; they're all made there," well, guess what, folks? Actually. China is a low-cost manufacturing place. I've done business in, India is a low-cost manufacturing base. I've done business there. I've seen what can be done. There's huge opportunities to actually, we could move the buying of goods from China, maybe actually let's do deals with Indian companies, have them made in India. That's a huge growth opportunity for India, part of the Commonwealth. Again, that's what competition engenders. So I think the concerns about China could actually play to India's advantage, and indeed to other Commonwealth countries in Asia, where you've got a low cost of land, a low cost of labour. They can be really powerful manufacturers in the future.
Richard, I'm conscious of time, so in the time we've got left, I'd like to focus a little bit on the EU and the Eurozone. The bloc has hardly covered itself in glory during this crisis. We have the Corona bonds debacle, we've had the German Constitutional Court ruling, borders slamming shut at times, medical exports being banned. We now have this proposed 500 billion euro Franco-German bailout package opposed by the Frugal Four. We've surely now seen the insanity of a common currency not backed up by a common government. But of course, the EU and the Eurozone, it's a union without a demos. It's a disparate nations with different proud histories that really cannot come together, certainly not come together in the way you need to build a sovereign state. What is your assessment of how the EU has handled the crisis? What do you see as the near-term future for the bloc?
Well, the reality is we saw that actually, when the pressure's on and the chips are down, all the individual member states basically looked after themselves. So as you've touched on, all of a sudden, there was a massive individualistic panic to buy equipment, medicines, and as you said, then also to ban exports. And the EU, frankly, was just left floundering. Some way back in the distance. It's gradually caught up as the crisis has moved on. But no, I think short term the EU, frankly, was completely useless. And many countries, I think of Italy, for example, feels that they were essentially abandoned by the EU, and they had to deal with this on their own. And so I think lots of nations have had a massive wake-up call. Economically, I was worried before the crisis. It's quite clear that you've got a sort of a two-speed Europe between what I call the Mediterranean, the southern states, and then you've got the higher growth, more cautious northern states in economic terms. And I couldn't see on a medium term how the Eurozone would hold together, and yet unless you had a massive transfer of debts and liabilities through the ECB between Germany and some of the Mediterranean states. And I think ultimately that is the only way the euro will be held together. I think this crisis has massively compounded their challenges, and I think that ultimately they probably will hold together by some convoluted piece of financial engineering that ends up being a fudge through the ECB, and is a sort of transfer of the liabilities. And so I think fundamentally somehow Germany will end up having to write off the debts that is owed to it by other southern European states. That's the only way I can see that it holds together. But they, sadly, they've got some difficult times ahead of them, just as we have. And I don't think that our economy is in much better shape than many economies across the rest of Europe, frankly. It's going to be difficult, but at least what we have got now is the ability to respond and use state aid where we see fit immediately. It frustrates me enormously that we have to go through some ludicrous charade this year when we've actually left the EU. We want to do some important government intervention to protect key industries, key businesses, and we still have to apply to Brussels for their tick box consent. I mean, it's just an absolute nonsense, but we're still going through it. And that highlights, at least, from here on, we can make those judgments. And I think the government will have to buy significant equity stakes in certain businesses and indeed potentially industries. And we're now able to do that and make those judgments. So in a sense, I think that's one way that we can try and help ourselves during the recovery phase. But no, it's going to be difficult for all of us. The EU has got, the individual nations have got their own economic problems, and then they've got all of the Eurozone debt problems. So really difficult times ahead. And I'm still completely confident that we have the opportunity to make a great success of Brexit. It requires leadership, it requires commitment, it requires experience. Bluntly, the government's got to get some better people in its cabinet from within the Tory backbenches, and there are some much better people on the backbenches than the front benches. And then those opportunities can be grasped. It would be a tragedy if we're talking in 3 or 4 years' time, and actually our recovery is held back and is really patchy because we haven't made the big, brave, bold decisions that we've now got the freedom to make as an independent sovereign nation.
Final question, Richard. We've spoken about a lot today. We've spoken about the government's handling of the crisis. We've spoken about the EU-UK negotiations. We've spoken about trade, reshoring, onshoring, critical industry, the Commonwealth, China. If you had one broad prediction or forecast, could be domestic, could be international, could be economic, could be political, but one broad forecast or prediction for the next 6 to 9 months, what would it be?
Golly, for the next 6 to 9 months. I'm trying to look for something positive, and I think the positive prediction is that actually people will start to recognise that Brexit's happening, and actually there are lots and lots of opportunities, and I think that's more and more people will admit it. You'll have all sorts of people saying actually privately, "Oh, I always thought it was a good idea, but my company wouldn't let me say so." So you'll have all of that. I think that's the upside. The challenge for our country and for all countries trying to recover from coronas is getting the economic foundations right to give businesses the opportunities to basically to stay afloat, to start investing again, to keep people employed, to give consumers the confidence to buy. And I'm afraid that requires bold leadership that says, actually, we've got to get back to 0 meter social distancing, and instead use really good hygiene and a really good track and trace system, so that we can get people back in shops and get people back in theatres and back in the offices and back in planes and trains, so that we can try and get life back to normal, and of course prepare for the next one, because this has been such a big wake-up call. But when the next one comes, and it'll probably come in the next 20 years, we have to be prepared for the fact that it could be much worse. So let's make sure we've got in place all of the lessons that we learned, so that we're really well placed to deal with it at the time. But in the meantime, we've got to get life back to normal. We've got to show some courage and some belief and some confidence in ourselves. Not easy, but I think it's doable.
Richard, that seems like a good, strong, positive note on which to end. So, Richard, Tice, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time.